So if you're watching this video around the time it was uploaded, you might think it's kind of strange that I would begin this series with part 3. That's not actually true. I actually uploaded parts 1 and 2 last week. I just did not label them as such. This is partially due to the fact that I'm just disorganized, but I also couldn't think of a good name for the series. You see, what I'm trying to do is I'm essentially building a case from the ground up. I believe that political bickering can best be understood as two separate sets of Darwinian instincts that historically kept separate from one another, but unfortunately they collide in the political realm. So if you want to catch up, if you haven't seen those videos yet, I've now renamed them and made a playlist. But also, I want each video to function as a standalone video as well. So what I basically do in each one is I'm forging my own single block that I can then use to build my tower. Now, where I left off the last video was I said essentially that the two different instincts are trained to deal with either external affairs or internal affairs. This is surrounding a small Darwinian tribe where our instincts evolved. Now, these lead to two separate archetypes that I'm sure you're already familiar with. The external affairs instinct is sometimes called the patriarchal one or the right-wing one, and then you've the internal affairs, the matriarchal left-wing one. All of these separate terms are kind of in the ballpark of these two archetypes. I don't know exactly what to call the archetypes themselves, though, but I'm sure you're already aware of them. But what I want to do in this video is just kind of expand on those simple parameters in that Darwinian context and just show how, therefore, these different sets of instincts develop. Now, if you recall from my last video, the basic setup that triggers all the other instincts is simply that the external affairs mindset is that the tribe is a small piece of a much larger environment, whereas the internal affairs mindset essentially sees the tribe as the entire environment, and everything proliferates from there. So, for example, one thing you get right off the bat is that as the external affairs mindset sees the tribe as relatively small, but it is also home, it is vulnerable, it is precious, it therefore must be defended. Now, this instinct is not really going to be present in the internal affairs mindset. It didn't really have time to evolve because once this side failed to defend the tribe, once they got in, they were just conquered and were slaughtered and assimilated. There was not really any time for that, a similar instinct over here to develop. So this side is going to see the tribe as vulnerable. This one's going to see it as robust, relatively speaking. Another difference between the two sides is the type of people that each side has to deal with, right? So in the external affairs, you might encounter, the people you encounter might be part of your tribe, a separate hunting faction or something, but it could also be the member of a different tribe. And that tribe could be friendly, but it could also be hostile. But in all cases, the important thing here is that these are adults who have their own agency, right? This is separate from the internal affairs, where, for one, everyone is a member of your tribe. It's just assumed because that's the full reality that that instinct operates in. But also, a lot of these people are children who do not themselves have agency. And then another difference would be the nature of the environment, right? So in the external affairs, the environment being outside your tribe is fundamentally competitive, whereas the one inside your tribe is fundamentally cooperative. I'm sure you've heard this one. So that also implies something about the resources that you gather, right? So in the external affairs, resources are a positive sum. You can come back to the tribe with more resources than you set out with, right? Whereas the internal affairs mindset, the resources are already here. It's a zero-sum game, right? You can start to see, and this is something I mentioned in another video, that left-wingers tend to see the economy as a zero-sum game. This probably has something to do with that. Now, there's one other difference that's really critical, but also rather subtle. So if you're not aware of this one, this might clarify a lot of things that you possibly found confusing before. And that is how malleable each side believes their circumstances are. And this has two components, both the people and the environment. Okay, so as far as people goes, right, when you think about the external affairs and the people they're dealing with, like I said, they're adults with agency. Well, they're adults. They're fundamentally outside your control, right? Your mindset is just how to respond to them. You're not trying to change them, right? Whereas the internal affairs mindset is going to see people as innately malleable because, like I said, they deal with children, right? Children are actually malleable. Like how they turn out is largely determined by the circumstances in which they grew up. So politically, the internal affairs mindset is going to start projecting this onto human nature, whereas the external affairs is more likely to just think in terms of how to respond to how people already are, right? So this one, this has a name or a couple different names. Thomas Sowell, in his book, a Conflict of Visions, talked about the constrained and unconstrained visions, but he didn't speculate on how those might have evolved. So this is my theory on how that came about. And the second part of this, like I said, was the environment, right? Which, once again, you can just work out the simple logic between the two. In the external affairs, the environment is that much larger competitive plane, right? So you have no delusions of changing the way of the jungle. You just need to understand how the jungle already works so that you can operate within it and get what you need. Whereas the internal affairs, like I said, the environment is the tribe. So the tribe sets the rules for the environment, right? If we're all supposed to do this or not talk about that or whatever, the entire the environment, the culture is to be led and shaped by the right people doing and saying the right things. So when you put all this together, you can easily explain why utopian visions tend to come from the left, because they have an instinct that tells them these things are fundamentally malleable. So now we can already apply this knowledge to specific examples. Remember in part 1 of this series, I brought up two specific issues. I brought up immigration and climate change. And I noted the oddity that the issues themselves seem to correlate one way, but political opinions tended to split a completely different way. Well, now, if you take the parameters I just laid out into consideration, we can explain all of that, right? So the immigration one is easy. The external affairs mindset, well, that's essentially what they were trained to do, right? I already explained this. When you see different people out in the wild, you're supposed to figure out who this person is, what their motivations are, and what they're going to do. Right? That same skepticism is not shared by the internal affairs mindset. Instead, it's going to immediately humanize anyone they see as part of their tribe, right? So think about how you would feel if a neighbor down the street kicked their 8-year-old kid out of the house, just kicked them out on the street. Now think about how the left views the right on immigration. It's basically the same, right? So you can explain all of this with everything that I've been saying, right? The issue of climate change is pretty straightforward too. It's specifically when I talked about the environment being malleable, right? So it's not so much that one side is enlightened and the other side is stupid or whatever. Again, this is not a video about climate change, the issue itself, just the psychology going in. The way I think the climate change debate fundamentally works is that one side is psychologically primed for the idea that humanity shapes the environment, and the other side is psychologically primed to believe that humanity doesn't shape the environment. And so, regardless of what the actual issue of climate change, whatever that verdict is supposed to be, the debate fundamentally comes from two completely different mindsets going in. Anyway, I think that's enough for one video. So if you thought it was helpful, please give it the usual interactions. Let me know what you think of it and subscribe to the channel because I definitely have more coming.